Penny said, I'm an obstetrician gynecologist, and I've been involved in women's medicine for over 10 years now. And I think probably the most powerful aspect of my work is experiencing with women and couples every day the incredible range of emotions associated with sexuality and reproduction. Watching women blame themselves for having a baby with a birth defect, watching women suffer the physical and the emotional pain of miscarriage, watching couples have infertility tear at their relationships is an incredibly powerful kind of experience. And one of the reasons that I went into occupational health is because an increasing number of my patients were beginning to ask me what the relationship was between adverse reproductive outcomes that they were experiencing in their workplace environments, in their community environments. And I didn't have many answers, as is true of many physicians that are out there in the community. As I got into the issue, I realized that there is a lot that is known about this issue, which I hope to share today. There's also a lot that we don't know. And I think when you take an issue that is really as emotionally laden as the issue of reproductive hazards, and you combine that with scientific uncertainty, and then you combine that with the tensions that already exist between corporations and employees, between corporations and communities, you're left at once with an issue that's not merely scientific, but in fact one that's also social and very political, as we all know. So today I hope that we can really get into a discussion not only about the science and kind of the ABCs of the science of reproductive hazards in the environment, but also a little bit about how this issue plays itself out in the real world of people and politics. If we can have the projector on and the lights out. I'd like to say first that the problem, that reproductive problems in the United States are not uncommon. Approximately 15% of couples in the United States are infertile. That is, that they're unable to conceive after having a year of unprotected intercourse. And in about 1/2 of these cases, the cause is unknown. About 20% of pregnancies end in miscarriage. And this is what we call clinically recognized miscarriage that actually happens after the first month of pregnancy. It happens, a woman gets a pregnancy test, she knows she's pregnant, and then she goes ahead and miscarries, and it's all pretty well documented and known. However, there are also early pregnancy losses that can occur prior to the first month of pregnancy. And when a woman may just be late for her period by a day or something, and she doesn't really even realize that she's been pregnant. And we're just beginning to look at that very early pregnancy loss. If you take the early pregnancy loss and combine it with the later pregnancy loss that we know about, we're actually seeing rates of loss as high as 75% of all conceptions. About 3% of children in the United States are born with major birth defects. It increases to about 7% if you include minor defects. And again, in about 2/3 of these, the cause is unknown. And when we say we're on the cutting edge, I think it's true. We are on the cutting edge because we are beginning to break into this unknown aspect of this problem and beginning to try to look at the problem of where the environment and workplace exposures really interface with this tremendous reproductive problems that we're seeing. Now, people talk about reproductive hazards as if it's a new issue, and in fact, it is in some ways, but there really is an incredibly rich history to the whole problem of reproductive hazards in the workplace that I think that we can learn a lot about. As far back as the early industrial era, there were reports in the literature of very high rates of fetal loss among women who were working in the lead industries. And also, interestingly enough, in the partners of men who were working in the lead industries were also having high rates of miscarriage. And we've learned a lot more about lead, which I'm going to be talking about a little bit later in the lecture. The pharmaceutical industry was really put on its toes with the marketing of thalidomide. Thalidomide was a drug that was marketed in the 1950s, and women who took thalidomide during the first trimester of pregnancy, the first third of pregnancy, gave birth to children with very severe birth defects, most notably shortening of the arms and legs. There are also heart defects and other things that went along with that. But the thing about thalidomide is that it had been tested in animals and found to be safe. And actually, after the human experience with thalidomide happened, toxicologists ran around trying to find an animal that was as sensitive as humans were to the effects of thalidomide, and finally came up with the New Zealand white rabbit. But this just changed the whole face of toxicological testing in the United States. The first kind of classic, what they thought of as an environmental toxin to come to public awareness, was that of mercury. And what happened was at Minamata Bay, Japan in the 1950s, inorganic metallic mercury was dumped into Minamata Bay by a plastics factory. And this was, as we heard this morning, converted by organisms in the water to organic mercury, and then accumulated in the food chain, and finally it came to be in very high levels in the fish. And community residents around the bay who consumed the fish during pregnancy gave birth to children with severe neurologic problems, including most notably cerebral palsy. Finally, I think the recent wave of interest in reproductive hazards in the workplace came with the dibromochloropropanone episode that we heard about this morning from the OCAW representative. And what happened here, as he said, was that there were men who were sitting around at lunch at a pesticide formulation plant in Northern California, realizing that few of them had fathered children since starting to work at the plant. And with the help of the union, played a very big role. Researchers were finally brought in, and there was found to be a correlation between chronic exposure to dibromochloropropanone and decreased sperm counts and sperm motility. In fact, many of the men had zero sperm counts. And there was recently a follow-up study that was done on the men, and those who had zero sperm counts 7 years later still have zero sperm count. And so it may be that dibromochloropropanone is a permanent sterilant for these people. There was also, after that episode, a study that was done in Israel that looked at the wives of banana plantation workers who were applying DBCP in the fields, and basically there was a threefold increase in the rate of miscarriage in the women whose husbands were applying the dibromochloropropanone. So that when we look at the history of reproductive hazards, there's many things that we can learn. The first is that reproductive hazards are not an issue just for women and babies. In fact, reproductive hazards can definitely affect both men and women, as we saw with lead and dibromochloropropanone. The second is that although we're getting much better at this, animal studies will not always be predictive, as we saw with the thalidomide episode, that this is most definitely both a worker and a community concern, and the more that we can link together our efforts, the better off we'll be, as we saw in the methylmercury Minamata Bay experience. And finally, that these are the kinds of things that we really have to look for in many subgroups. Dibromochloropropanone had absolutely no other signs of systemic toxicity. And I would say that were it not for the courage of those men to sit and talk to each other about an issue that was so personal and so private, researchers may not know today about the effects of dibromochloropropanone. Now, I divide reproductive hazards into three general categories so that we can think about them here. One is physical agents like X-rays, heat, and kind of the broad category of trauma or stress. The other is the infectious agents, most notably the viruses. And finally, we have chemical agents, including drugs and industrial chemicals. And what I'd like to do is to take us on a journey, basically, through the reproductive system of men and women, and to begin to talk about where reproductive toxins might exert their effect on the reproductive process. And as I do that, I will interweave through the talk different examples of workplace and community exposures that are known or suspected to damage the reproductive system at particular points. The first thing to realize about reproduction is that it's under very careful control in the body by certain chemicals called hormones, okay? These chemicals are released by the brain, they enter the bloodstream, and they affect the ovaries and sperm production and all of the reproductive processes. They regulate the whole ballgame. And a clinical example that I think most physicians here, at least, probably have experienced in their practice, is that a woman comes in, she says, boy, I haven't had a period for a few months, or I'm really having irregular bleeding. And one of the questions, if you're an astute physician, that you ask is, have there been any unusual stresses that have occurred in your life over the last few months? Because indeed, what we know is that stress, high levels of emotional stress or physical stress, can interfere with the hormones that are coming from the brain here and regulating the reproductive processes. In fact, what happens is the hormones just plain get turned off. And if they're turned off, then women don't ovulate. They don't put the eggs out from the ovary, and when you don't ovulate each month, you get irregular periods, or you lose your periods altogether. So it's kind of a perfect example of sort of an environmental influence, and one that I'm sure people fighting in communities around contamination of their communities and so forth are under incredible amounts of stress. And I don't have to tell you that, and that this is something that I think we need to pay a lot of attention to. However, stress isn't the only thing. Actually, what they found is that there's certain pesticides also not only the pesticides, but polychlorinated biphenyls, the PCBs, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, that also can act like hormones in the body. And when they do this, they interfere with the body's natural hormones and can lead to the same kinds of things like menstrual irregularity. And there's actually a number of studies in the scientific literature that have looked at women who are applying pesticides in fields and so forth, and found them to have increased rates of menstrual irregularities and so forth, and that may be related to some of these estrogenic properties, or some of these hormonal properties. Now, the next place that we would think about a toxin exerting its effect is on what we call the germ cells, okay? The germ cells are the sperm in men and the eggs in women, okay? In men, the germ cells, the sperm basically, are produced inside the testicle here, okay? And after they're produced, the sperm enter these tubules here, and then in the process of ejaculation, they are ejaculated to the outside of the body. And in men, the process of sperm production is a constantly renewing, ongoing process of cell division. Okay, men are just making millions of sperm daily, and the time that it takes for a cell, when it starts to divide in men, to the time that its sperm is actually made and released into that tubule, takes about 74 days. So what this means is that if you have a toxin that affects these cells back early in the process here, it may be actually a few months before it shows up, because it has a long ways to go before it actually gets it, put into the tubule there. And the other thing is that if you have damage to sperm, like these cells here, it may take a long time for you to recover. If you get damage to the initial cell here, it may never recover. And that may be what happened in dibromochloropropanol. Women, on the other hand, have a very different story. Women don't make new eggs. Women get all the eggs they're ever going to have prior to birth. And they're not making new ones, okay? So what happens is that women, this is birth here, by about the 5th prenatal month, when you're still in the womb, you have about 7 million eggs. And through a natural process of destruction, basically, atresia it's called, this falls to about 2 million by the time of birth, about 400,000 by the time of puberty, and only about 400 of these eggs are actually released by the ovary each month, one at a time, in the process of ovulation throughout the reproductive lifespan of a woman. So that one of